risk gets shifted to the public. Well, the revenue risk isn't taken by the private concessionaire. What's that?
What the availability payment?
Okay, so we just had a big project that went availability payment in Virginia called US 460. So nobody thinks the toll revenue in this project will ever pay for the facility. So what the state has done is to say, okay, we pledge money over a period of time, over the period of a concession agreement. Here's an annual flow of funds, and we will pledge that to the concessionaire once the project is available. That's what they call it, availability payment. So once the facility is up and operating, then the availability payments start to flow. Now there is something called appropriation risk. You know, what if a future General Assembly doesn't appropriate the funds? And there's a little bit of hand waving to say, does this fit under the state's debt cap? The states are capped often in how much debt they can issue. And Wall Street looks at and rates states, and if the rating agencies are saying this is debt, then does it count against the state's debt cap, and does it affect their credit rating? And I think that is very state specific. Of course, the P3 advocates would like it to be outside the debt cap because there is appropriation risk. The General Assembly is not legally obligated to pay the money. And federal leasing has sort of worked this way for many years. It's a contract. The feds can cancel a contract with General Dynamics to provide desktop services for an agency, and they can do it without cause, but they're not allowed to go and procure the same service from anybody else for a period of months or years. So if they just change their business model and say we don't really need employees at the Department of Commerce anymore, so we're just going to cancel our contract with General Dynamics to provide desktop services, that's a risk General Dynamics is willing to take, but it's a contractual obligation, but not one that is counted against the debt cap. So you can see it's just a little bit shady.
And is it a guaranteed minimum, but if the project brings in enough revenues without the availability payment, the government doesn't pay?
I think that's project dependent. I mean, it really, there is toll revenue, I think, on US 460, but nobody expects it to be enough.
Right.
And a lot of people are saying, well, no project can be 100% private these days. And I'll talk about, if we have time, 495 express lanes on the Washington Beltway. And even there, the state did put some money in, but they also put in the right-of-way, which, is, I don't know how you value it, but we know it's really valuable. And so that's not private contributions, that is a public contribution. So
you mentioned that was actually my exact question. And you mentioned down there, it takes away the benefits. I can see the cost, but why the benefits in private sector?
well, if you,
If like, for example, if I collect toll, and if the contract is set up so that if I win out, then, I can collect however much toll I get, then why would I lose the benefit?
well, I guess what I meant by that is that you're losing you're losing the capital from the private markets. It's now being guaranteed against government expenditures as opposed to private expenditures. So you're not paying, you're not actually getting the user, adhering to the user pays principle. Instead, you're stepping away from that and say the government pays, not the user. Now, the user's paying the government, of course, but when you break that connection between user and payment, you sort of remove a bit of a market test to say, is a project, is it viable?
So it's the public side that loses the benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're not getting additional revenue. I mean, P3s or infrastructure banks, a lot of folks think, well, these are money. But of course, money doesn't fall from the sky. It's got to come from users or from taxes. It's not, you get some value capture in some cases, and we'll talk about an air rights project in Virginia in a minute, maybe, where you're you are creating new value, and some increment of that value then goes onto the tax rolls and generates tax increments. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I guess if the, like you said, it's project by project, so if the contract is set up so that the payment from the government is a guaranteed minimum, and the private sector gets the user fees if there is a profit, then I guess it doesn't really take away the benefits from the private sector.
Fair enough. I mean, you don't, I think what you have, what you lose is a market determination through toll and revenue studies that says, yes, this project is going to be self-financing through users. And when you go through, a non-market process to that and say there are governmental guarantees, then you're losing some of that market test, which a lot of people claim to be a big benefit of the P3 model. So.
Yeah, but I think that'll change if our economy picture changes. But in this economy, the lenders are just not going to move unless there is some kind of guarantee from the government.
That seems to be the case at the moment. I mean, apparently our secretary was in Morgan Stanley in the last couple of weeks, and they say, it's revenue risk is off the table in a lot of projects. So if you want to attract, P3 concessionaires to your state or to your jurisdiction, you have to take some or all of the revenue risk at the state, at the entity government level. It's not going to be rolled off to a private investor. So, okay, yeah.
To what extent does this create moral hazard, though? Like, if our revenues exceed forecasts, then the private sector wins. If they don't, then the public sector pays for it.
Well, yeah, I think there's a Jean Shaul, I think, is a writer, British academic, and she wrote a great article called Highway Robbery about the private financing initiative under the Thatcher, beginning with the Thatcher government, where the public takes all the risk and the private takes all the profit. And so you sort of have a heads I win, tails you lose type of arrangement. I think one of the interesting things about South Bay and about Pocahontas is that they prove, or they don't prove that it will always be the case, but they prove at least can be the case, that private entities who put their capital at risk can lose. And it's not going to be renegotiated to shift it back to a government body and say the government body is going to bail them out at some point. And if you look at P3s, World Bank's done lots of work with P3s around the world in the developing country space, and I reviewed a book there, and he had a sentence that just killed me. It was, renegotiation is an opportunity. I think what he meant by it is it's a chance to fix, things, because, you don't want projects to just be walked away from and let loose. But I think in a lot of areas, and there's certainly claims in the UK example that you had, very opportunistic behavior by the private actors who took the profits but never took the losses. We've had at least two, experiences here in the U.S. where we've had significant private losses, but I think that's shifted our thinking a little bit. Let's see, you had a question, I think. No? Okay. Okay, good. So, let's see. So there's not very good data on P3s. We have an electronic newsletter called Public Works Financing, which has been around since the 80s, and they have collected and developed really an Excel spreadsheet of projects. This is number of projects, so it's sort of not very useful in the sense that some of them are really small projects and some of them are a little bit larger, but one of the things that if you're doing research in this area, it's very hard to get your hands on useful data. We just got crucified on a paper that was reviewed, coming back saying, how can you possibly come forward with data this bad? But it's just really, really hard to get good data. There are issues about Transparency, I mean, are the concessionaires gonna be willing to share information? There are issues about, I mean, even the census of governments doesn't, unless the money touches the government and passes through the government's hands, it's not gonna be captured in the census of government. So I'm not sure, say, on the 495 Expressways project, or $2 billion project, whether that $2 billion will appear as capital, in the capital accounts. That's something that we're trying to figure out. But the data is a real problem, yeah.
Isn't that a bit problematic, since as you were saying, all the money has to come from user fees or taxes in the first place, if there's no transparency?
Well, so it is problematic, and I think that's an important provision of these comprehensive agreements, is to be able to say, how much transparency will there be? I mean, usually auditors, you would have to say that you produce auditable, you have to have audited financial statements. But, I mean, and it's not just a private sector problem. I mean, the Maryland Transportation Authority owns and operates the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and the John F. Kennedy Expressway that goes up there through Maryland and so forth. They report their total revenues, and they just opened something called the Intercounty Connector in suburbs of Washington, Maryland suburbs of Washington, which is a toll road. And they do not release project or facility-specific information, period. Not to the legislature, not to the, they are extremely closed about it. And the legislature, they're fighting about this all the time. Because the poor rural folks who commute across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the idea that their toll revenue is cross-subsidizing those rich suburbanites in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, outside of Washington, D.C., infuriates, the politicians who represent the people who are paying those Bay Bridge tolls. So, but Maryland is, they don't open their books to the project level. And I think that's a question. And it's something that has to be in the comprehensive agreement. Now, 495 Express Lanes have been releasing information on a quarterly basis about average daily traffic and their revenues and so forth. They've been pretty transparent, but it depends on the agreement. If you have a rate of return hurdle or cap that is going to be on the concessionaire agreement to say, well, you can't earn over 15% or 18% or something, then you need to have an audit trace that can go in there and say, well, these are real rates of return, and they're not just padding in, the country club and fresh flowers to the office and whatnot as an expense that's reducing their rate of return. So, but that's part of the concession agreement, and those aren't standardized yet. And I think that's part of the transaction cost, is the fact that we don't have standardized contracts that are sort of wide industry standards on these things. The fresh flowers is probably a bit far-reaching, but some of the other things that might be car and driver, those sorts of things are a little bit hard to police sometimes, unless you have a pretty good audit capability to go in and say what's being charged against the cost side of the transaction. Okay, so this sort of hits, P3, and these are not legible, I apologize. Wastewater, buildings, motorways, rail, toll roads, wastewater. So it's just that there's, across sectors, that's the projects that we were looking at. This is I think 600 projects. So let's see, it's 18 minutes of 12, and we have to go back into room at 12. So I can talk a little bit about the Virginia experience. I've mentioned some things, and I want to say, I insist on saying one 30-second commercial for our center at the end. So, but I'm also open to questions. So if there are questions here, I don't want to take up all of our time. So yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that some states have more P3 projects, for example, Florida. What drives that?
Interesting question. I mean, what drives that, or what motivates that, whatever. It's hard to say. Where does that? Why is Virginia a leader, and why are other states not? I think Kansas has, something in them. Some states have toll prohibitions in their state constitutions. And so, you know, you really, it's part of the political culture of the state. We don't have much of a national P3 policy in the US. It's very state specific. So when you enter the US market, you're not entering one market, you're entering 53 markets, and or 30, you know, 35 if you want to look at the ones that have explicit legislation. So I think we've seen a big uptick in the number of states that are interested in this, because I think there's a growing recognition that the federal funding is not going to be forthcoming. Looking for leadership to Washington on infrastructure spending is, you know, probably not going to happen. And I think as people tackle that or grapple with that and say, how do we maintain or renew and expand our capital assets, P3s appear to be an attractive option. And I think we've seen a lot of increase in things. And I think it's not only labor, it's also the contractor world. I mean, it really changes the role and it's a big challenge for a contractor to go into a project where they're going to take on these new risks. You know, when you enter into a project, you have to have surety bonds that say, if I fail to deliver my obligations on this project, you know, I bought insurance to cover my counterparty on that. Well, that's very expensive insurance, and if you don't have very deep pockets or can't self-insure, then you're not able to participate. Well, there's a lot of state and local, you know, contracting firms that don't have the wherewithal to do that, and so you see big firms like Sintra and Transurban coming into the space and saying, we got deep pockets, you know, we have we can self-insure, and we'll sub out some of the work to Joe's Paving or, you know, the XYZ Bridge, bridge company. And contracting is very, very local, you know, and contractors have been politically powerful in, you know, many states for many, many decades. And so getting the contractor community to realize there's a need for change, I think, is another thing. But ARTBA, the Association, American Road and Transportation Builders Association, which represents all the contractors pretty much in America, is, you know, saying we continue to press Washington for additional funding, but we also realize that we need to work with our state governments to try to figure out how to enable P3s across the country. So I think it's changing, but it's a complex set of issues.
So when you're researching this, what kind of stuff are you looking at specifically? There seems to be a relatively small N of big projects, so it almost lends itself perhaps to case studies or comparative approaches.
We have been.
You mentioned contracts. You're looking at a lot of contracts and a lot of financial models.
Yeah, I mean, what we're trying to do in the center is a P3 policy. So we're not sort of trying to do the financial engineering end, which is a lot of people, you know, there's been a lot of work in that around the country. And we're not trying to do the project delivery end, which, you know, has very good people working on it here at Georgia Tech and elsewhere, you know, looking at innovations in project delivery. So we're really trying to look at what is the policy and regulatory environment. How do you deal with the moral hazard issues? How do you deal with the transparency issues? We have, at least initially, done case studies at the project level or at the state program level. And one of the questions is, what are the institutional arrangements that really foster a healthy climate? What are the characteristics of state enabling legislation, the best practices? And we have a white paper on best practices that we sort of garnered from looking around the country. You know, legislatures want often to say, we get the final say on a project, and they would like, you know, a final okay before the thing goes. But if you're asking a private contractor to invest tens of millions of dollars on developing a full-blown proposal, and then the legislature has a hold-up opportunity to say, oh, by the way, I don't see the road to my township in this project. Do you think you could just add that? Or some version of that. I don't see labor protections. I don't see small business protections. I don't see local content protections in this agreement. Could you just add that and then I'd be happy to vote to support it. And, if you put 10 or, $15 million into developing a fully engineered proposal, and you're at the point of signing an agreement, those are very expensive changes. And of course, one's willingness to invest that kind of money in a project development is going to be lessened if there's a legislative kickout or, gate. But I want to say a word before we wrap that about this project in Virginia. Yeah, this lawsuit. So this is a really interesting project, and it's happening right now. So I thought you might be interested in it. It's, Midtown Tunnel is a project in Norfolk, Virginia, which is, of course, a historic port city. And there's an old tunnel built in the 50s with tolls and paid for with bonds. The bonds were paid decades ago. The tolls were removed. The tunnel is a 2-lane tunnel, so 1 lane in each direction. And it's a huge bottleneck, and it's in terrible condition. So it needs to be renewed, and it needs to be expanded. So a proposal came forward to build a second tube and to restore the old tube and put tolls on both tubes to pay for it. Well, it's caused an explosion. Even though the original tunnel was built with tolls, the fact that they were removed has caused a huge amount of pushback from the legislators in that community and from the citizens in that community. And so they brought a suit. So the project was awarded. It's a big, I think, $2 billion project was awarded, a concession agreement of, I don't recall the duration, but of a couple of decades. And they went to court. The citizen group went to court. And in a local